Well, a happy Thursday afternoon, everyone. I'm Ben Bohall with the Nebraska Forest Service, and you're watching Through the Thicket. We're live every Thursday at 12:30 Central Time to talk trees and plants, and we'd love to hear from you guys. You can go ahead and leave any comments, or maybe you have some questions about planting. We're definitely coming up on planting season here soon. Fall is right around the corner. We're here with Graham Herbst. He's a regular with the show, and well, I guess how everything's going, Graham.
Really good. We've been under some travel restrictions with the COVID-19 stuff, and those have been loosened a bit. I was able to get out to Ewing, Nebraska yesterday, take a look at some declining ash trees in their park. Fortunately, we didn't see any suspicious EAB activity, but boy, was it nice to get some fresh Nebraska country air and, look around Ewing a little bit.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm going out to Valentine this weekend. I was looking forward to kind of getting outside the apartment and everything, looking forward to nice weather. But now they're
Yeah.
saying it's going to be 103 degrees on Saturday. And it's like, oh man, I don't know if I want to go camping after all. But then it sounds like we're going to get a nice kind of cool off and we'll have kind of more of that fall weather starting up next week. So I am looking forward
Yeah.
to that. But so last week we talked about tree containers. And it sounds like today's going to be part two of that, right?
Yeah, we're going to get into some of the newer types of tree growing technologies and why we like them and what their pros and cons are and where you might, well, I guess we won't cover where you can find them much, but there are a handful of nurseries around the state that have already started to try this stuff out. So I'll just get right into it. Root pruning containers, as we mentioned last week, with bald and burlap trees, the primary concern we have is the root loss associated with digging that tree up out of the ground and only having some smaller portion of the root system that the tree grew into the ground. And with containers, the challenge is more so with not losing roots as much, but having roots growing in an orientation that can be encircling the base of the tree and a problem over time, and not allowing those roots to spread out and really take advantage of the soil volume they have available. So these root pruning container systems are designed to, rather than allow a root to continue to grow longer and in a circle, the roots are directed towards a hole in the container that actually prunes the root by being exposed to the air. And just like a branch, when we prune a root, that encourages and stimulates growth behind that cut so that the ultimate product is a nice, fine, fibrous root system rather than a whole bunch of roots that are real thick and long and growing in a circle. And we'll get into some pictures that demonstrate that a little better. In this first picture here, we see some different, it looks like maybe hickory or oak seedlings and the strong taproot that comes out of those right away. And so just to give a real brief primer on tree biology, inside an acorn or a nut of any sort, there are two seed leaves called cotyledon. And these seed leaves have energy that the tree has stored in them that give the tree seedling that first little boost of energy before it's grown any leaves to produce energy on its own. It's sort of the rocket fuel for the space shuttle, if you will, that allows it to get up into the atmosphere. So trees that have a really strong taproot are problematic for a bald and burlap situation or a container of any sort. So with a root pruning container system, we're able to take that taproot and prune it or just destroy that orientation of it growing down in order to stimulate those fibrous roots. These small roots that you see on the right side coming off the side, those are the functional roots that are actually taking water and nutrients out of the soil. Larger roots, as we've discussed in previous episodes, are much more to do with storage and anchoring the tree and keeping it upright. But it's those small feeder roots that we really want to have a lot of in order for the tree to do well and establish in the ground. So when we look at a root pruning tray like in these photos, you can see these sort of terraced ridges that as the roots encounter the edge of this plastic pot, they're directed to areas that have holes in them so that that root doesn't continue to get longer and thicker and instead is pruned by the open air and allowed to get more fibrous. And then we end up with a root system that looks much more like this on the left. And on the right-hand side, looking at these acorns, rather than having that seedling on the left-hand side, we're much more interested in buying a tree that has a root system like on the right. So here's an example, a case study of a tree that was grown in a system like this. It was harvested out of a field as a 6-inch tree, meaning the trunk of the tree was about 6 inches wide, and it was grown in this root maker system that was invented by Carl Whitcomb. I guess it is also worth mentioning, you're going to see some copyright symbols and patent pending sort of thing. This is kind of proprietary technology, but there are also a couple different versions of this. So I don't want anybody to interpret this presentation as an endorsement of a particular root pruning system. We have some that we have more experience with and more pictures of, but there are a couple different systems out there. So 6 years old from seed germination, this tree was grown in this Whitcomb system and then planted out in the field. It was then grown in the field for 3 years in a fabric container, which we'll see later, and then they harvested it later. And we do this a lot for the research, for the science, for the learning, right? Who wants to dig up a perfectly good 6-inch tree unless we're going to learn something from it? And so that's what's going on here. And this is really what we want tree root systems to look like when they're in the ground. Obviously, when it was harvested, there were a lot of roots clipped that we don't see here, but you can get a good sense of how that tree had a root system that was really growing like spokes on a wheel, which is the analogy that I keep returning back to, that works so well for visualizing the end goal. So there are a number of ways that we root prune, and it has to be done multiple times throughout the process of the tree getting to a saleable size. There are flats like this where you broadcast seed, and they are open on the bottom and on a mesh table so that the root pruning is occurring, in this case, just on the bottom of the flat. And then these seedlings, as they're root pruned and get to an appropriate size, can be bumped up to a single container for one seedling once they get a little bit larger. So the 4-inch rule that we like to talk about with root maker refers to once a tree or a shrub is growing in a root pruning container and it's sort of filled that container, we want to bump it up to give it another 4 inches or so of space. So we're not leaving it in this root pruning container too long, because we can still have the same problems as stem girdling roots if they languish in too small a container for too long a period of time. And we also don't want to bump it up into a container that's excessively larger than the one that it was in before. So 4 inches is a nice incremental bumping up of the material as it continues to be root pruned and stimulated into this fine fibrous root system. Some of the other types out there are Anderson pots. These are smooth-sided, but they still are open on the bottom. And again, these are often employed for trees that have a strong tap root and don't root very laterally in their early life stages as a seedling. And on the right side is a root maker tray, just like what we saw in pictures a few slides back. The point here is that as we're in this critical phase of seedling germination and growth, if we have a container that's allowing a root to start to grow in a circle or in a square, around and around, as soon as that root starts to get woody and hard, that orientation isn't able to be changed. But if I go back a bit, if we have a root system like on the left here, we can still tease roots that are in this white tender stage apart and get them oriented in a way we want without having to clip them off altogether. So as we grow these root pruned trees into larger size containers, you can get into what looks like a more traditional black plastic pot. But as we see when we look down into the container, there are these terraced ridges. And those ridges, it's not easy to see in the photo, but there are holes drilled at very regular intervals along the top sides of those ridges to, again, further stimulate and air prune the roots so that they branch and keep lots of fine feeder roots inside. And on the right-hand side, sort of the end goal that we're looking for. all the roots, even in that tree in the top right corner, we can tease all those out if need be, even though they're starting to get an orientation that resembles a stem girdling root. The other sort of form that this technology takes is more of a fabric bag. And the right hand plastic sleeve is just a tool that's used to keep the bag in its shape as we're putting soil into it. So the bag is on the left hand side. It resembles sort of like what you might have taken with you to college to put your dirty laundry in when you're you know, studying in college. Or I mean, it's not a college thing necessarily. That's just sort of what I associate it with. But they have lots of small holes in the bag that are designed for that same purpose of root pruning as the tree grows. So another quick revisiting of some basic tree biology. If we look at this color-coded, I've turned this on its side because we're looking at this as a root instead of the stem of the tree. But the blue tissue, that's the phloem, is the tissue that moves energy that the tree has already produced into the root system to store it for later time. And the red part, the xylem, is what's moving the water and nutrition from the ground up into the tree. So when we turn this 90 degrees to look at it as far as the orientation of a root that's growing out of this bag, the reason this is so important is because the phloem that's on the outside that moves energy into the root system is the first tissue to be constricted by these holes in the bag. So by having these holes just the right size, as a root grows through that hole and starts to get thicker, that blue tissue that you see that's moving energy out of the bag is constricted. So any roots that we pop off of the outside of the bag at planting time have much less energy stored in them, so we have less energy loss for the tree when we plant it. So here's an example of some trees that have been put into these bags. They've gone through a handful of root pruning containers that were smaller leading up to this size. And now we have this fibrous, wonderful system that's going into the bag. So what Bob does for us at the statewide arboretum when he's growing trees in these bags is he'll set them right on top of the ground. And then they're all healed into a nice thick layer of mulch. Now, why would we not want to dig these down into the ground just like a tree would grow anyways? Well, there's a couple reasons. The first one, of course, is that it's very labor intensive to dig all those holes. It takes a lot less time to take a pitchfork and a pile of mulch and pile all that around the trees. Also, we'd have more difficulty getting the trees out of the ground because they still do root out of these bags. And so there's a lot more tugging and pulling and ripping that occurs if we put them down into the ground. But another wonderful reason for doing this is that a pile of mulch has a lot of gas exchange. And, you know, again, referring back to some concepts we've talked about in previous episodes, gas exchange is the #1 limiting factor for tree root systems. So if we can give these trees a cool, well-oxygenated environment to grow in this pile of mulch, not only does it not fight us a lot when we try to take it back out, but it's really desirable for that tree to grow aggressively and at an optimal level and get everything that it needs to drive those biological processes of growth. So then these trees grow on for usually one growing season, occasionally two. And we have wonderful trees with a root system inside of there that's much better. So going back to the point of roots growing past the bag, you'll see on the bottom left here, or bottom right and the top right, this sort of button that's left behind. And what's really worth pointing out here is that if we start on the top right, we have this what looks like a large single root growing out of the bag. It's actually a number of roots that have kind of fused together. And in the bottom right, we see everywhere those lighter colored dots are is where the root was still attached. And that snaps off really conveniently and has much less wounding to the root than if we were to cut a root that size entirely for one reason or another, whether it's digging it out of the field or we have a container with a huge root and we need to cut it because it's growing around the base of the tree. So we're minimizing the amount of root damage that's occurring. We're minimizing the amount of energy that's in that root that we're taking off. And it just works really fantastically. So the idea here still is to take the entire bag off when we plant it. And this is what's left behind. Now, not only do we have a lot less damage where we see these lighter, this lighter grid of root tissue that was snapped off, but those are also initiation points for new fine feeder roots as well. So further stimulating that fibrous root system when we snap that root off to the buttons that you see here. And most species respond this way. You know, all tree species have a little bit different character to the way that they grow their root system, but most trees that I've encountered in these bags exhibit this quality. The other bag that we can talk about is root trapper. So this is where we're getting back to something more like a black plastic pot, where we're not allowing any of the roots to escape the container. But in this case, we have a bag that's made up of a fabric that's similar to the weed mat that you might put underneath some river rock in a landscape. It's thicker than weed mat is. And the reason for that fabric is because it's designed, when the root grows towards the edge of the bag, the fabric sort of ensnares the tip of that root and minimizes the chance that it's going to turn to one side or another and start to do that circular growth. So we're not air pruning in this case. We're not allowing that root to grow through the bag and then, you know, be exposed to the open air and die back and branch behind it. But we are still sort of, the fabric does some work of minimizing the chance of that root starting to circle. Now, why do we have a white bag? Obviously, nurseries spend a lot of money on watering trees. So a black plastic pot seems like a pretty silly material to have a tree sitting in to get hot and transpire moisture, and now you're working against the nursery in its watering needs. So obviously a white material makes more sense from a standpoint of saving the nursery money and water. And then again, the fabric inside of that white layer on the outside is sort of that weed mat material. So in the nursery, these trees can be lined out just like a black plastic container. They can get the little drip emitters to make that watering easy and frequent, and has all the convenience that a black plastic pot does in terms of a tree that's a size that a person can put in the back of a pickup, or sometimes even into, you know, an SUV of some sort, and take that home without having something that's excessively heavy or large or difficult to manage. This can also be done in a pot-in-pot system, just like black plastic. So this is a picture from Todd Fowler's nursery out in York, Nebraska. And so the black plastic pot is just a placeholder in the ground for that tree to come in and out as they're sold, without having to constantly dig new holes for trees as they get healed in until they're sold. Again, you can see the irrigation emitters that are in place for each tree. And as I mentioned before, one of the benefits of this is that when I'm doing plantings with young kids, the kids can do the whole all steps of the process. They can dig the hole without it needing to be an hour to accommodate a huge balled and burlap tree that they can't even lift and move. They can, you know, be hands-on with every step in the process. And this is so critical, not only for the success of the tree being planted properly, but also getting our young people connecting with trees and nature and seeing the value and having some skin in the game and being able to go back later and say, that's a tree that I planted and I'm proud of it still. So there's pros and cons to these different systems. Again, the root trapper bags like we're seeing here are much more akin to the black plastic container, whereas the knit fabric bags and the root pruning containers are much more like a B&B situation, where we're allowing the root system to grow like the wagon wheel. We do still have some root loss, but we've taken some steps to minimize the impact that that root loss has on the tree when we plant it.
Hey, Graham, I'd be curious really quick here, and not looking for specific figures or anything, but what about from like a cost perspective? Are there any that might be, fairly more expensive than the other?
I think these white plastic or the white fabric bags and black plastic are going to be pretty comparable in price. Um, and the knit fabric bags are probably going to be more comparably priced to the other two than a B&B tree that's much more expensive. Part of the expense of balled and burlap trees is not only that they're a larger size, but it takes a lot more labor to handle big, heavy balls of soil. So it's not as accessible for the average homeowner to go pick up a B&B tree and bring it back home, especially because even if you put a B&B tree in the back of a pickup, you've got 3 foot to get it back down off of the pickup onto the ground that can often compromise the root ball integrity and have the whole thing fall apart when you plop it out of the back of the pickup onto the ground.
Yeah, obviously we don't want that. Yeah.
Yeah, unless you have 2 or 3 people to assist with that bigger B&B tree coming out of your pickup, it's probably just going to drop on the ground after it comes off the tailgate. One other thing that I forgot to mention with these fabric bags, not necessarily a downside, but a limitation, is that we cannot take these trees out of the mulch bed in the middle of summertime. So there's a more limited time of year that we can actually make trees that are grown this way available for sale, mostly early spring and late fall. But I would say that that's primarily when we should be planting trees anyways. So it is a little restrictive in terms of not having the entirety of the proper tree growing season where they're accessible. It's more the beginning of spring and the end of fall where we can disturb this root system and take it out of the mulch pile. But that just sort of keeps us honest about planting trees at times of year that are conducive to the tree being successful in the first place. But it is worth mentioning that when we grow trees in these fabric bags in a mulch pile, when they're fully leafed out like you see in these photos here, and you take that out of the mulch pile and start popping off roots on the outside of the bag and rip the bag off and plant it, there is going to be some of that shock that we normally associate with some of the other growing systems as well. So, ask the nursery that you like to work with whether they carry trees in this situation. There are shortcuts that nurseries can go through that don't produce the same rootstock quality. It's not so much about the container as the nursery practices that are being used. So in a fabric bag like this, it can sit in that bag for too long and you can have stem girdling roots. You can get good trees out of black plastic pots. You can get bad trees out of fabric bags. So you can't use the container that the tree's in as a litmus test for whether it's a good root system inside. It's just an indicator that there are steps being taken to ensure better quality, but it's not proof positive that you're getting a better product just because it's in a bag instead of a black plastic pot. So I don't want to bias people too much away from more traditional ways of growing trees. Balled and burlap is a tried and true method that has been shown to be successful. Same with black plastic pots. These new container technologies are just a step in the right direction to get us to a root system that's going to ensure a tree that's more likely to live a long time, establish, get to its actual mature size, and not be under constant stress from poor root system quality throughout its life. Are you seeing anything on the chat, Ben?
Yeah, in fact, I've got a question here. I'm going to go ahead and pull up. We've got one from Amy, and she asks, can you talk about what happens to the roots when they become entrapped in this fabric versus growing outside of the mesh bags?
As opposed to growing out, repeat the question for me again.
Yeah, sure. And I'm competing with my parakeets in the background. I'm sure everybody's hearing that. So Can you talk about what happens to the roots when they become entrapped in this fabric versus growing outside of the mesh bags?
Right. Okay. So we're comparing the green bags to these white root trapper bags. So, and I did get into the fabric bags a bit more in terms of allowing the root system to grow outside of the confines of that green fabric bag. Um, there is root loss associated there. With these white bags, we're sort of meeting in the middle between a black plastic container that forces all the roots to stay inside and doesn't, actually encourages the roots to grow in a circle. In this case, circling stem girdling roots are still a potential in a bag like this because we're not allowing any root system to escape the bag. But the fabric is doing a little bit of work to minimize the likelihood as that root tip meets the fabric, it gets sort of tied up in that fabric and is more likely to get cut off and branch behind there. Although, as I've mentioned before, the chance for stem girdling roots still exists in these bags. Um, so I think that gets to the question. I hope so. Maybe Amy can elaborate a little bit if there's more that I need to discuss on that, or if that's not quite getting to the heart of her question.
Yeah, Amy, please feel free if that answers or doesn't answer the question entirely, follow up right on in our chat there, and we'll try to get to it either today or else next time around. Also have a nice comment here, Graham, from Caitlin. She says, as my dad considers how to replace his ash trees, this information is so helpful. I can't wait to share the information.
Fantastic. And we've got a treat for you next week, Caitlin, because we're going to have Justin Evertson on, and we're going to be discussing. Justin is sort of our tree list guru.
Oh, yeah.
In the agency. Justin puts together fantastic lists of trees for you to consider for all different growing contexts in Nebraska. We've got tree lists for the Panhandle, for eastern Nebraska, for wet sites, for dry sites, for trees under power lines, and we have a list of trees that are good alternatives for ash as we're starting to look to replacing and removing those trees. So tune in next week because we're going to have the man himself on to highlight a handful of those trees on that list that you should be considering as you're looking at your ash trees in your landscape or in your neighborhood and thinking about what to plant afterwards. Spoiler alert. There's not 2, 3, 4, or 5 answers to this question. We need to throw the kitchen sink at this thing and put a lot of diversity into the replacement of ash so that we're not making the same mistake that we did with Dutch elm disease and all those neighborhoods that were lined with a monoculture of elm. And then we had a pesky little beetle that spread a disease through those elms and took all those trees away and really left a lot of neighborhoods completely bare for a long time. So we're going to be highlighting some favorites, but it's an extensive list of trees that you should be considering to replace ash. And as a homeowner, as an individual property owner, you have a unique situation to stick your neck out a little bit and try something that's maybe not tried and true yet. There are some tree species out there that we just don't know enough about that seem to be adaptable to our climate in the Great Plains, but we haven't planted it enough to know how much we can rely on it. So if you have a space where just one or two, you only have room for a tree or two, try something different where a city government really has to put most of their eggs in that basket of the trees they know are going to grow well because they need success in ways that we don't on an individual homeowner level, where if you plant a tree and it struggles for a little while, you can replace it and there's not much lost in that effort. And we've actually learned a little bit by trying that tree.
Yeah, I would echo your comments there, Graham. Diversity is definitely key, particularly as we've seen with this situation with ash. And my wife and I are in a good position where we do that. We have a nice diversity of trees that we've tried, and it's kind of a fun experiment too, really, in the long run, to see what's going to do well and what's not. I'm going to add a link into the chat for the NFS website. We do have a list of trees that we find to be pretty suitable replacements for ash, so I'm going to include that here in the list.
Yeah, and we'll be drilling down into that list next week. The one that I think about all the time, if I were just to throw, because we don't have a species highlight for this week, so why don't I do one off the cuff? Um, Tulip poplar or tulip tree is a tree that grows predominantly in Appalachia. We think about Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, um, but it is pretty well adapted to a decent chunk of Nebraska. I've grown it successfully as a street tree in Omaha. We can find individual plantings of tulip poplar in South Sioux City. I think it's probably not, we can probably reliably say that it's not going to do well in Chadron or North Platte, but we need to try here and there. And certainly central Nebraska is where we get into that sort of coin flip moment where it could do okay or not so much, but it does like to have a site that doesn't stay dry for long periods of time. So it may be a tree that you need to give some TLC to in a year like this year where we've gone a long time without some rain and some pretty high temperatures. It's doing pretty well, and maybe I'll pull up some pictures of the one that I planted on the street here in Omaha to show kind of how it's performing.
That's kind of a relief to hear. That's one of the trees that I planted as well, actually. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to plant trees that not only get a big mature size to them, that casts a lot of shade, gives a lot of homes for birds and critters, all those eco services that we like in big mature trees. But it's also got a beautiful floral display to it too. Lots of our big shade trees don't have a lot of those aesthetic qualities that people look for in trees. And it's part of why our urban forests are dwarfing to some degree. It's a two-part answer. One is because of poor rootstock quality, we don't get those shade trees to ever get to those mature sizes. But we also have the public buying a lot of little ornamental trees that have those fireworks in the springtime that everybody likes to see. So whenever we got a shade tree that also has a beautiful flower to offer, that's just a win-win.
Well, Graham, it looks like we are just about out of time. By the way, Amy did respond, and she said you did answer her question, so thank you for that.
Yep.
So it sounds like we're going to have a great episode next week. It's always fun to have Justin on. He's definitely a fan favorite at NFS and NSA. We'll remind folks that if you think of any questions, up until next week, feel free to drop us a line at our email address. That's at trees@unl.edu. And of course, if you watch this video and you think of something, after the fact, you can always leave it in the comment box, and we'll come back and check that as well. So, Graham, always a pleasure.
Yeah.
I guess have a good weekend. Try to enjoy the weather if you can, and we'll talk again next week.
Yeah, let me add two more brief points here.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
We're sort of competing with ourselves right now because the statewide Arboretum is doing their brown bag series. And so definitely we could give some information for people to check out that show as well that's weekly. And the other one is, aside from questions, if you've got a topic idea, you don't necessarily have to have a question for us, but if there's something about trees that you want to hear us discuss, definitely send that our way as well. And we'll see everybody next week.
Sounds great. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Take care. Bye.